Margaret Albright believed in bloodlines. She believed in legacy, in the clean, unbroken chain of succession that stretched from her husband's grandfather, a man of industry, down to her son Liam, and then, this was the sticking point, to the child he was inexplicably failing to produce. The family dinner, held in the cavernous dining room of their stone-clad mansion, was not a celebration. It was a tribunal. The polished mahogany table reflected the cold light of the crystal chandelier, making the entire scene feel submerged, aquatic, and dangerous. Alara, her daughter-in-law, sat opposite her, a picture of infuriating calm. Margaret had always found Alara's composure to be a form of passive aggression. It was the quiet stillness of a person who thought they were better than you, who judged your pronouncements from some secret, internal high ground. Margaret intended to demolish that high ground tonight. She had given Alara and Liam 3 years. 3 years of a beautiful home, a generous wedding gift, 3 years of inclusion in a family of significant social standing, 3 years of waiting. Her patience, a notoriously finite resource, had been exhausted, so she had laid down the law. An ultimatum delivered with the sweet, chilling poison she had perfected over decades of social warfare. A grandchild within the year, or there would be consequences. She didn't specify the consequences, which made the threat more potent. It could mean anything from social ostracization to, more terrifyingly for Liam, a complete revision of the Albright family trust. Margaret held the reins of the family's social and financial future, and she wielded that power without apology. She saw the flicker of panic in her son's eyes, the way he glanced at his wife, pleading, but Alara did nothing. She simply placed her linen napkin on the table, her movements deliberate, her gaze unwavering. Margaret felt a surge of triumphant fury. The girl was finally broken, silenced by the sheer weight of the demand. What Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend in her world of brute force ultimatums and inherited power, was that Alara was not broken. She was armed. Inside her simple leather handbag, nestled next to her wallet and keys, was a plain manila envelope. It contained no weapon, no deed, no check. It contained something far more powerful, a truth, printed on clinical letterhead, that would not just demolish Margaret's high ground, but vaporize the very bedrock of her identity. Within the next 10 minutes, the Albright legacy, the one Margaret held so dear, would be revealed as a tragic fiction of her own making. We hope you're settling in for this one. It's a story about the quiet battles we fight and the hidden truths that can change everything. If you love stories that deliver that final, satisfying moment of justice, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We'd also love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Now, let's get back to that dinner and see how this all began. The pressure had not started with an ultimatum. It began as a series of small, corrosive drips of condescension, each one designed to erode Alara's position within the family. Margaret was a master of the subtle wound, the insult wrapped in a compliment. "Oh, it must be so lovely for you, Alara, to have your little drafting hobby," she'd said a year into the marriage during a family brunch. "It keeps you occupied while Liam is doing the real work of building his career." Liam, a vice president at his father's manufacturing firm, had shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew the truth. Alara was not a hobbyist. She was a licensed architect, a partner at Helios Design Group, one of the most innovative and sought-after architectural firms in the country. Her hobby had recently won them the prestigious commission for the new Riverside Museum, a project that had been the talk of the city for months. But Alara had never flaunted it. She preferred her work to speak for itself, and she had little interest in the social climbing that so fascinated her mother-in-law. Liam had mumbled something about Alara being very talented, but the defense was so weak it was barely audible. It was his pattern. He loved his wife, but he was terrified of his mother. He had been conditioned since birth to seek her approval and avoid her wrath, a psychological cage from which he had never truly escaped. Alara had understood this early on. She saw the conflict in him, the genuine affection for her warring with a lifetime of filial obedience. She didn't push him to fight battles he wasn't ready for. Instead, she absorbed the blows with a quiet dignity that Margaret consistently misinterpreted as weakness. "Of course she's talented," Margaret had replied, waving a dismissive hand adorned with heavy gold rings. But a career is about legacy, about building something that lasts, like a family. The word hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Alara had met her gaze and offered a small, polite smile, saying nothing. Inside her mind, however, a separate ledger was being kept. Every slight, every condescending remark, every moment Liam failed to stand for her, was noted and filed away. She was not a victim. She was an observer, collecting data, waiting for the right moment to present her findings. Later that evening, after the brunch, Liam had tried to apologize. "You know how she is, Alara. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." "How does she mean it, Liam?" Alara had asked, her voice even. She was sitting at her drafting table in their home office, the scent of paper and graphite a familiar comfort. She held a perfectly sharpened 2H pencil, turning it over and over in her fingers. It was a simple tool, but in her hands it could transform a blank sheet into a soaring structure. It was a symbol of her power, controlled, precise, and creative. "She thinks I'm a decorative, unproductive drain on her son's potential," Alara stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Liam sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's just old-fashioned. She thinks about heirs and the family name. It's all she talks about with Dad." "And what do you think about?" Alara looked at him then, her eyes searching his. He was a good man, handsome and kind, but there was a fundamental weakness at his core. A fear she was beginning to worry was insurmountable. "I think about us," he said, and she knew he meant it. But us existed in a bubble, and his mother was constantly sharpening pins to burst it. The conversation ended there, as it always did, with an uneasy truce. Liam was relieved to have avoided a fight, and Alara was left with the quiet hum of her own thoughts, the pencil still in her hand, a silent promise of a structure yet to be built, a reckoning yet to be designed. She knew then that a confrontation was not a matter of if, but when, and it would have to be on her terms, designed with the same precision she brought to her blueprints. The escalation came 6 months before the final fateful dinner. It was Margaret and Robert's 40th wedding anniversary, a lavish affair held at the most exclusive country club in the state. Hundreds of guests milled about, a sea of expensive silks and tailored suits. Margaret was in her element, the queen surveying her court. She found Alara near the grand staircase, speaking with a city councilman about the new zoning variances for downtown development. Margaret saw not a civic-minded conversation, but her daughter-in-law wasting time that could be spent networking with the wives of more important men. She swept in, a whirlwind of perfume and entitlement. "Alara, darling, there you are." "Councilman," she said, giving the man a nod that was both a greeting and a dismissal. He took the cue and melted back into the crowd. "I was just telling Charlotte Astor how her daughter-in-law is expecting twins." "Twins! Can you imagine such a blessing? She's positively glowing." Margaret patted her own perfectly coiffed hair, her eyes scanning Alara's flat stomach with theatrical disappointment. Alara's smile didn't waver. "That's wonderful for them." "It is," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It secures things, you know. Robert and I have been speaking with our estate planners." This was new, a direct financial threat. "We're making some adjustments to the will. We believe in rewarding contribution to the family's future. A grandchild, you see, is the ultimate contribution. It shows a commitment to the Albright name to the next 100 years. The implication was brutally clear. No baby, no inheritance for Liam. It was a vicious move, designed to turn husband against wife, to create a siege from within their own marriage. Alara felt a cold clarity settle over her. The drips of acid had become a flood. Margaret was no longer just being cruel. She was actively trying to destroy their marriage to get what she wanted. Alara thought of Liam, of the pressure this would put on him, the terrible choice his mother was forcing upon him. She felt a surge of anger, not hot and reckless, but cold and sharp, like a shard of ice. This was the catalyst. Margaret had declared war. Alara would now prepare the battlefield. That night, she couldn't sleep. Liam was tossing and turning beside her, already consumed with anxiety over his mother's words. He had cornered her in the car on the way home. "Did you hear what she said? About the will? This is serious, Alara?" "I heard," she'd replied, looking out the window at the passing city lights. "So what are we going to do? We have to..." We have to do something. What do you suggest, Liam? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. We just try harder? Is that what you mean? He flinched. No, of course not. It's just my mother is playing for keeps. She is, Alara agreed. And so am I. The next morning, while Liam was in the shower, Alara made a phone call. It was not to a fertility clinic, as Liam might have hoped, or to a marriage counselor, as a friend might have advised. It was to a number she had stored years ago, for a man she had never met, but whose name she knew well. Dr. Moreau's office. This is Anya speaking. Good morning, Anya. My name is Alara Albright. I need to speak with the doctor regarding a former patient file. It's a sensitive archival matter. There was a pause. The doctor is retired, ma'am. I'm aware, Alara said calmly, but I believe he maintains certain records privately. The patient's name was Margaret Albright. The file would be from approximately 35 years ago. It's a matter of the utmost importance, and I am prepared to compensate for the time and discretion required to locate it. She was taking a huge risk, acting on a fragment of a story she'd overheard years ago from a disgruntled former housekeeper of Margaret's, a hushed, bitter comment about a difficult birth and secretive doctors from out of town. It was a long shot, a wild guess based on a ghost of a rumor. But architects are trained to see the load-bearing walls in any structure, and Alara sensed that Margaret's entire identity was built around a single hidden pillar. She intended to test its strength. After a long, tense negotiation, the voice on the other end of the line agreed to look. A courier would deliver the results of the search, if any, in a sealed envelope. The open loop had been cast. Now, all she could do was wait. The day of the dinner arrived cloaked in a heavy gray drizzle that matched the mood inside Alara and Liam's home. The air was thick with unspoken words. For weeks, ever since Margaret had announced this family meeting, a palpable tension had been building, winding tighter and tighter until it felt like the very atmosphere could snap. Liam had been a ghost of himself, pale and anxious, pacing the length of their living room. He had pleaded with Alara that morning, his voice strained. Just whatever she says tonight, let's just agree. Nod, smile, tell her we'll work on it. We can buy ourselves some time. Alara was standing by the large window overlooking their garden, watching the rain beat on the glass. She was dressed in a simple, elegant navy blue dress. Her demeanor was unnervingly serene. Buy time for what, Liam? For her to come up with another, more cruel way to humiliate us? For her to drive a wedge so deep between us that we forget we're on the same side? We are on the same side, he insisted, his voice cracking. Then stand with me, she said, turning to face him. Her eyes were not angry, but filled with a profound sadness. Not behind me, not halfway between me and her. With me. He had no answer to that. He just looked at her, his face a mask of helpless misery. He was a man caught in a current, and he lacked the strength to swim against it. Alara knew then that she would be facing his mother alone. She had hoped it would be otherwise, but she was not surprised. An hour before they were due to leave, a courier on a bicycle, drenched in rain, arrived at their door. He handed Alara a stiff, waterproof packet. She signed for it, her hand perfectly steady. Inside, she found a standard manila envelope, sealed with tape. There was no return address. She didn't open it. She didn't need to see the contents yet. The fact of its existence was enough. This was the final piece of her design, the keystone that would hold the entire structure of the evening together. She walked back into the living room and placed the envelope into her leather handbag, zipping it closed. The click of the zipper was a small, final sound in the quiet room. Liam watched her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What's that? It's a contingency plan, she said softly. He looked from her face to the bag. For a fleeting moment, a different kind of expression crossed his features. Not fear, but a glimmer of something else. Awe, perhaps. He was seeing a side of his quiet, artistic wife he had never witnessed before. He was seeing the strategist, the fighter. But the moment passed, and the fear returned, washing it away. Alara, please, he whispered. Don't make this worse. I have no intention of making it worse, she replied, picking up her coat. I intend to make it clear. Across town in the Albright mansion, Margaret was performing her own pre-battle rituals. She adjusted the placement of the silver, critiqued the floral centerpiece, and instructed the catering staff with an iron will. She felt a heady sense of anticipation. She was utterly confident. She had cornered them. The financial threat, she knew, would have been working on Liam for weeks. He was a soft boy, her boy. He would never risk his inheritance, his entire future. And Alara, the quiet little mouse, what could she do? She had no money of her own to speak of, no powerful family to back her up. She was entirely dependent on the Albright good graces. Tonight, Margaret would receive their capitulation. She would get her promise of a grandchild. She would secure the legacy. She looked at her reflection in the polished surface of the dining table, a queen, triumphant, surveying her domain, completely oblivious to the architectural flaw in her own foundation, a flaw that was about to bring the entire palace crashing down. The quiet before the storm was over. The first guests were arriving. The main course had been cleared away. The scent of roasted duck and cherry sauce lingered in the air, a rich, cloying perfume for the execution to come. Robert, Liam's father, sat at the head of the table. He was a man who had faded over the years, his own ambitions and personality subsumed by his wife's overwhelming force of will. He was a silent partner in her domestic tyranny, providing the financial weight but leaving the dirty work to her. Tonight, he seemed more of a spectator than a participant, his gaze fixed on his wine glass. Margaret cleared her throat. It was not a loud sound, but it had the effect of a gavel striking wood. The low murmur of conversation around the table, cousins, an aunt, a close family friend, immediately ceased. All eyes turned to her. This was the moment from The Hook, the scene replaying in its full, dreadful context. "I'm so glad we could all be together tonight," Margaret began, her voice smooth as cream but laced with steel. "Family is the most important thing. It is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Our business, our reputation, our future." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She looked directly at Liam, then shifted her gaze to Alara, a predator locking onto its prey. "A family is not a static thing," she continued. "It must grow. It must look to the future. A name, a legacy, is only as strong as its next generation." The air grew colder, heavier. Alara felt Liam's leg bouncing nervously under the table. She laid a hand on his knee, a gesture that was both calming and commanding. He stilled. "Liam and Alara have been married for 3 wonderful years," Margaret said, the word wonderful dripping with sarcasm. "We have welcomed Alara into our family. We have given them every advantage, every opportunity to build a beautiful life." She leaned forward slightly, her diamond earrings catching the light. Here it comes, Alara thought, the killing blow. But a house is not a home without the laughter of children. A legacy is not a legacy without an heir to carry it on. We have been patient, but our patience has its limits. She picked up her water goblet, her knuckles white. "So, we are making our expectations clear. We expect a grandchild. A commitment to one. A plan within the year." Her eyes narrowed. "Or there will be adjustments to everything." The threat, now spoken aloud in front of the extended family, was absolute. It was a public humiliation, a declaration of Alara's failure as a wife and a woman in Margaret's eyes. The room was utterly silent. The cousins stared at their plates. The aunt looked at Margaret with admiration. Liam looked like he was about to be physically ill. He opened his mouth, a desperate squeaking sound emerging but no words. All eyes were on Alara, waiting for the tears, the apology, the desperate promises. They waited for her to crumble. But Alara did not crumble. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water. She placed the glass down with a soft click. Then she looked across the polished expanse of mahogany, directly into her mother-in-law's triumphant eyes, and she began to speak. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Margaret," she began, her tone one of reasonable, almost academic discussion. "You speak of duty and legacy. I agree. They are important concepts." A flicker of confusion crossed Margaret's face. This was not the reaction she had anticipated. "And you are right to be concerned with the future of the Albright name," Alara continued calmly. "A legacy is a fragile thing. It must be built on a solid foundation, a foundation of truth." With a movement that was fluid and unhurried, Alara reached into her handbag. She did not slam the object on the table. She did not wave it like a weapon. She placed the simple manila envelope gently on the polished wood beside her plate. The sight of it, so mundane and yet so pregnant with unspoken meaning, drew every eye in the room. "Before you make demands about the future," Alara said, her voice dropping ever so slightly, "I believe you should be fully aware of the facts of the past." The manila envelope sat on the table like a quiet bomb. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to possess any real power. The chandelier, the silver, the crystal, all of it suddenly looked like cheap stage dressing. Margaret stared at it, her triumphant expression curdling into one of suspicion and contempt. "What is this, Alara? Some kind of pathetic theatrics?" "A letter from your lawyer," she sneered, attempting to regain control. "This is no time for games." Liam, jolted out of his paralysis, reached for the envelope. "Alara, what are you doing? Stop this. Just stop." His voice was a panicked whisper. Alara placed her hand over his, her touch firm. She didn't look at him. Her focus was entirely on the other end of the table, on the man who had remained silent for so long. "This isn't for you, Margaret," Alara said, her voice still impossibly calm. "And it's not for Liam." She gave the envelope a gentle push. It slid across the gleaming polished wood, a perfect frictionless glide, coming to a stop directly in front of her father-in-law, Robert. "Perhaps you should read this first, Robert," she said. Her use of his first name, so direct and shorn of its familial title, was a shock in itself. "It concerns the legacy you're so worried about. I believe the contents are yours, in a manner of speaking." Robert looked up, startled, as if woken from a long sleep. He looked from Alara's unreadable face to the envelope, then to his wife, whose face was now a mask of rage. "Don't you dare touch that, Robert. This is a private family matter between me, my son, and this girl." But her command had lost its sting. The power in the room had shifted, flowing away from her and coalescing around the silent, unassuming envelope. Robert hesitated for a moment, his life's habit of deferring to his wife warring with the undeniable authority in Alara's voice. He looked at Alara again, and in her eyes he saw not malice, but a kind of sorrowful certainty. His hand, trembling slightly, reached out and picked up the envelope. "Robert, I said no," Margaret hissed, half rising from her chair. He ignored her. With fumbling fingers, he broke the seal and pulled out a single folded sheaf of papers. They were old, the letterhead slightly yellowed. The typewritten font characteristic of a bygone era. He unfolded them. The room was so quiet that the faint crinkle of the paper sounded like a thunderclap. He began to read. Alara watched his face. She knew what he would be seeing. A geneticist's report from 35 years ago. The patient's name, Margaret Albright. The subject of the report, her newborn son, Liam Albright. It would be dense, clinical, full of terms like hereditary condition, Y chromosome microdeletion, and autosomal recessive. But at the very end, there would be a summary, a conclusion written in plain, devastating English, a diagnosis of absolute irreversible infertility, passed directly from mother to son. A secret Margaret had received in a quiet doctor's office more than 3 decades ago, and had buried so deep she had perhaps convinced herself it wasn't real. Robert's face, already pale, drained of all remaining color. His jaw went slack. He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening comprehension. He didn't look at Liam. He didn't look at Alara. He looked at his wife of 40 years. It was a look of profound, soul-shattering betrayal. "Margaret, what is this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Margaret tried to laugh it off, a brittle, ugly sound. "It's a forgery, a lie. She's trying to poison you against me." She lunged across the table, trying to snatch the papers from his hand. But Robert, for the first time in their marriage, reacted faster. He jerked the document away from her grasp, holding it aloft like a piece of holy scripture. "It has the doctor's name on it," he said, his voice shaking. "Dr. Moreau, from the clinic in Westchester, the one we went to after the difficulties with the birth." The memory, long suppressed, had been unlocked. The room fell into an even deeper silence. The cousins and the aunt looked on, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. They were witnessing the live demolition of a dynasty. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but a strangely quiet chaos. The carefully constructed facade of the Albright family, a structure decades in the making, was disintegrating in real time. Margaret, for the first time in her life, looked utterly lost. Her face, usually a canvas of imperious confidence, was a mess of disbelief and panicked denial. "It's a lie," she repeated, her voice rising in pitch, becoming shrill. "She's a vindictive, barren little snake, and she's fabricated this to hurt me, to hurt us." But the words had no power. The evidence was in her husband's hand. Robert was still staring at her, the genetic report trembling between his fingers. The betrayal was so immense, so fundamental, that it seemed to have short-circuited his ability to process it. "All these years," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else, "all these years you knew. You let us build our entire lives around a future you knew was impossible." His voice broke on the last word. The accusation was devastating, not just because of the lie, but because of its target. Margaret's cruelty hadn't just been directed at Alara. It had been a constant grinding pressure on her own son. Liam, who had been frozen in a state of shock, finally seemed to process what was happening. He looked from his father's ashen face to his mother's frantic denials, and then to Alara, who sat amidst the wreckage she had wrought, her expression one of grim resolution. What does it say?" Liam asked, his voice a raw whisper. Alara answered him, her tone gentle but firm, cutting through his mother's continued hysterics. "It says you're not capable of having children, Liam. It's a genetic condition, one that was passed to you. It's not your fault." Margaret shrieked, "She's lying. Liam, don't listen to her." But Alara wasn't finished. She delivered the final, perfectly engineered blow, the quiet bomb that recontextualized everything. "You demanded a child, Margaret," she said, her voice ringing with a terrible, quiet clarity. "You demanded it from the one person in this world you knew could never give you one. You punished your own son for a limitation you gave him. That was it." The moral mirror, the truth reflected back with such force that it shattered Margaret's defenses completely. She sank back into her chair, gasping, all the fight gone out of her. The lie was too specific, the details too precise. Dr. Moreau, the clinic, the difficulties. It was all true. Liam stared at his mother, and for the first time, he was not seeing the powerful, intimidating matriarch. He was seeing a cruel, deceitful woman who had tormented him his entire life for a secret she herself was keeping. He saw the years of pressure, the endless questions, the disappointed sighs, the comparisons to other, more successful sons. It had all been a charade, a sick, twisted performance where she was the only one who knew the ending. He felt the psychological cage he had lived in his whole life simply evaporate. The bars, which he had always thought were made of steel, were revealed to be nothing but smoke. He was free, and in that moment of terrible, painful freedom, he had a choice to make. He could stay mired in the wreckage of his childhood, or he could move toward the future. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. He stood up. His mother looked at him, her eyes pleading, desperate. "Liam." But he didn't look at her. He looked at his wife. He looked at Alara, who had known this truth, who had armed herself with it not for petty revenge, but as a shield against a war she had never wanted to fight. He saw the strength he had always mistaken for passivity, the integrity he had failed to defend. He walked around the table, past the stunned faces of his relatives, and stood behind Alara's chair. He placed his hands on her shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but it was the most definitive statement he had ever made in his life. He was choosing his side. He was choosing her. He was choosing the truth. The weeks that followed the dinner were a slow-motion collapse. The Albright family, once a formidable monolith, fractured into broken pieces. The cousins and the aunt who had witnessed the revelation spread the story through their social circles, not with the full clinical details, but with the more potent, simplified version. Margaret Albright had been exposed in a lie so profound it had destroyed her own family. The whispers followed her everywhere, to the charity luncheons and the country club, places where she had once reigned supreme. Her power, which had been built on a foundation of perceived moral authority and unassailable status, crumbled overnight. Robert moved into the guest wing of the mansion, The silence between him and Margaret was a vast, cold chasm. The trust, nurtured over 40 years, had been annihilated in a single evening. He couldn't look at her without seeing the decades of deception, the needless cruelty she had inflicted on their son, the hollowness of the legacy she had so fanatically pursued. He was a man adrift, questioning every pillar of his life. For Liam and Alara, the path was more complex. The revelation had not magically fixed the cracks in their marriage. It had exposed them to the light. They started counseling. In the quiet, neutral space of a therapist's office, Liam began the painful work of dismantling the man his mother had built. He spoke of his fear, his weakness, his shame at having failed to protect his wife. "I always knew she was cruel to you," he admitted in one session, his eyes fixed on his hands. "But I told myself it was just her way. I didn't want to see it as a choice she was making, and I didn't want to admit that my choice was to do nothing." Alara listened. She did not offer easy forgiveness. She had carried the weight of his weakness for 3 years, and she would not pretend it was a light burden. But she saw the genuine remorse in him. She saw the nascent strength, the man he could be now that he was free from his mother's gravitational pull. It was a beginning. About a month after the dinner, Margaret appeared at their door, unannounced. She looked smaller, diminished. Her expensive clothes seemed to hang on her, and the arrogant fire in her eyes had been replaced by a desperate, pleading look. Liam, to his credit, stood firm. "You should have called Mother." "I wanted to talk to Alara," Margaret said, her voice thin. Alara, seeing the look of panic on Liam's face, stepped forward. "It's all right, Liam." She led Margaret into the living room, but did not invite her to sit. The power dynamic, once so skewed, had been permanently inverted. "I came to apologize," Margaret began, twisting the strap of her handbag. "What I did, it was wrong. I was just so focused on the family, on continuing the line." Alara held up a hand, stopping her. "An apology is for a mistake, Margaret," she said, her voice devoid of heat, but full of weight. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a decision 35 years ago, and you made thousands of other decisions every day since then to perpetuate a lie and to use it as a weapon against your own son." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Redemption requires more than apology. It requires a fundamental change, and frankly, I don't believe you're capable of it. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught." Just then, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. A woman in a sharply tailored suit stepped out. It was Anya Sharma, Alara's business partner at Helios Design Group. She was the firm's brilliant, no-nonsense managing director. She strode to the door, her expression quizzical as she saw Margaret. "Alara, are we ready? The award ceremony starts in an hour, and I want to go over your acceptance speech one more time. Winning the National Architectural Guild Prize for the museum is a big deal." Margaret stared, dumbfounded. "The museum? The National Architectural Guild Prize? This was the little hobby?" Alara gave Anya a small smile. "I'll be right out." She turned back to her stunned mother-in-law. "I have to go, Margaret. I have a legacy to build. My own." She walked out the door, leaving Margaret standing alone in the house she had gifted them, a relic of a power she no longer possessed. Liam simply closed the door, shutting his mother out, and for the first time it felt like he was shutting the door on his past and stepping into his future. The passage of time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges of a crisis, not by erasing the damage, but by allowing new growth to emerge from the ruins. 6 months after the night that broke the Albright family, a new, quieter reality had taken hold. Robert had formally filed for separation from Margaret. He had not done it out of anger, but with a kind of weary resignation. The lie was too big, the breach of trust too absolute. He sold the large mansion, which now felt haunted by false pretenses, and moved into a smaller, more modern downtown condominium. He began to travel, to read, to reconnect with old friends his wife had long since dismissed. He was, in his own quiet way, starting over. Margaret was a ghost in her own life, isolated and stripped of the social currency she had valued above all else. Her friends offered her pity, which was worse than their scorn. She was a cautionary tale whispered about at the country club, a fallen queen. Without the power she had wielded for so long, she seemed to have no purpose, a hollowed-out shell of her former self. For Liam and Alara, the healing was a deliberate and ongoing process. Their marriage, now founded on the bedrock of a hard-won truth, was stronger than it had ever been. Liam, having finally stepped out of his mother's shadow, was becoming the partner Alara had always hoped he could be. He took a keen interest in her work, attending gallery openings of her designs, and speaking of her accomplishments with a fierce, genuine pride. He was learning to define himself not by his lineage, but by his own character and his commitment to his wife. One crisp autumn afternoon, they sat together on the sofa in their sunlit living room. The space between them was no longer filled with tension, but with a comfortable, easy intimacy. Spread out on the coffee table in front of them were not blueprints or financial statements, but a series of glossy folders. Inside each folder was the profile of a child. They had decided together to explore adoption. It was a path they were choosing on their own terms for their own reasons, driven not by familial duty or the pressure of a legacy, but by a shared desire to build a family rooted in love and choice. Liam picked up a folder. It was for a 5-year-old boy with bright, curious eyes who loved to draw. He smiled, a real, unburdened smile, and showed it to Alara. "He likes to draw," he said softly. Alara leaned her head on his shoulder, looking at the picture. "Maybe he's an architect," she murmured. There was no sadness in her voice, no sense of a second-best option. There was only hope. The pain of the past year had clarified everything. It had taught them that legacy is not about blood. It is not about a name carved onto a building or a line drawn on a family tree. True legacy is about the love you give, the integrity you live by, and the safe, honest world you build for those who come after you. It is the quiet strength that endures long after the noise of arrogance and power has faded away. Alara looked at the child's smiling face, then at her husband, the man who had finally found his own strength, and she knew, with the certainty of a perfectly designed structure, that their foundation was now strong enough to build anything upon. And so, a new chapter began. Not one dictated by the demands of the past, but one they would write themselves, word by word, choice by choice. The journey to building their new family was not without its own challenges, but they faced them together, a united front. The ghost of Margaret's ultimatum no longer haunted their home. It had been replaced by a quiet excitement, the thrill of a future that was truly their own. What Margaret had intended as a weapon to break them apart had, in the end, become the catalyst that forged them together, stronger and more authentic than ever before. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most destructive storms are the ones that clear the air for good, revealing the solid ground that was there all along. We tell these stories because they reflect the truths of our own lives, the struggles for respect, the pain of betrayal, and the deep, satisfying hope for justice. The world is full of Margarets, people who believe their power is absolute, but it is also full of Alaras, people whose strength is quiet, whose worth is not for sale, and whose integrity is their ultimate shield. It begs the question, doesn't it? What is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it the legacy they inherit, or the one they build with their own hands and their own heart? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments below. What did you think of Alara's decision? Was it justice, or was it revenge? Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found yourself rooting for Alara and Liam, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of struggle, triumph, and the quiet vindication that reminds us that truth, in the end, is the most powerful legacy of all. We'll see you in the next one.